Hi everyone, Perry Coleman here. I'm a botanist and I run a small consulting company called Delta Environmental Consulting. I've spent something over 4 decades messing about in salt fields, salt marshes and salt lakes. And today I'll be talking to you about salt marshes found between the land and the sea. I may even mention the Eyre Peninsula's famous cuttlefish. Most typically, tidal salt marshes occur above the mean high tide, the landward side of the mangroves, and below the highest spring tides. Other types of salt marsh are also common in southern Australia. We have supratidal salt marshes, which are coastal salt marshes above the highest tides on very salty land. And we have salt lake fringing salt marshes around our inland salt lakes. In Australia, salt marsh development is largest in the southern part of the continent, while mangrove development is largest in the northern parts. However, the tropical, temperate and arid coasts all host salt marshes to some degree. When it comes to salt marshes, geomorphology rules. That's the shape of the land. In the diagram, you can see the obvious change in the vegetation depending on where they are in the slope in relation to the tide. Basically, the mangroves grow from around low tide up to about mean sea level. Low marsh, dominated by Cyclocornia glassworts, starts growing just below mean sea level and grows up to around the high tide mark. Mid-marsh, dominated by mixed Hectorcornia samphires, grows higher again up to where you get mean higher high water, which is the tide that comes once a month or so. High marsh, where blue bushes, salt bushes, grasses and forbs can be found, grows where the tides rarely reach and where some regular land-based runoff or brackish estuarine water can be found. Here in South Australia we have another different type of supratidal marsh habitat called sabkas. These are semi-closed basins, often wind-scoured to a level lower than the surrounding high marsh, and they're subject to occasional storm-driven inundation from the sea, with very little freshwater input and high evaporation. Only a couple of species of samphire, including the vulnerable fan samphire, can tolerate living in such an inhospitable habitat. The diagram that we have here shows some little magic test strips above each habitat, marked with the average soil conditions for each. I really wish I had such handy dipsticks. What they actually have to show us is not wholly unexpected. Basically, the marshes get drier as you go up the slope until you reach those funny sabkas. Being depressions and containing underlying frangipans or hard layers of gypsum crystallised under the surface, the sabkas are as wet as the mid-marsh. The salinity is indicated on the strips by how much chloride is present in the soil. It's high in the low marsh, higher even than in the mangroves, where the tide comes very often and sunshine concentrates any tidal water that's left behind as the tide goes out each day. As you head upslope, salt levels fall because they're washed out of the soil by rainfall or stormwater runoff. It's about the balance between the frequency of tidal inundation and the frequency of freshwater washing it out. This changes as you reach the closed basins of the sabkas, which do not allow any of the salt water that arrives to be removed. Evaporation is greater than rainfall, and so all of the salt that arrives in these pans just stays there. They are the saltiest of all these near coastal habitats. pH in the low marsh with good tidal circulation generally is the same as that of seawater. In the mid-marsh, where tidal exchange is less frequent, but the substrate stays very wet, there is a lower pH because of the breakdown of the sulfates that are present in seawater in the moist anaerobic conditions. The high marsh is drier and has less sulfates from seawater, just as it has less chlorides, so the pH is higher. The sabkhas are moist and the sulfates are high, so the pH falls again. Finally, the test strips show us the soil types. Regular water movement in the low marsh can remove really fine materials, so many of the low salt marshes around the Eyre Peninsula, not all, can be quite sandy or have sandy loams in them. The less frequent inundation in the mid-marsh allows more loamy soils to accumulate, and in the high marsh there can be clay-rich loams. The sabkhas are basically pure mineral clays. Small areas of coarser material accumulate on the surface as tiny, wind-driven ridges, but the flat basins are just clay-dominated. All those different soil conditions explain why the plants that you see occur in bands in salt marshes. The diagram below is a quick look, but you can see that the variety of species increases as you go upslope in the intertidal zone. We're not looking at the sabkhas in this diagram, although you may have observed when you visit the coast that while the variety is more upslope, the density of the canopy is greatest downslope. That's because downslope is somewhat wetter. Doug Fotheringham surveyed South Australia's local saltmarsh vegetation associations back in the early 1990s, and he determined their preferences, so we actually know a fair bit about the inundation frequency of most South Australian saltmarshes. But although this is an area I'm fascinated with, and I could spend all day expounding on it, let's move right along. Okay, I'm a botanist and it shows, doesn't it? But on to the animals. The salt marshes have three main habitats that interplay in a food web. The aquatic areas of the creeks, channels and pans are one area. The benthic mud surface of the salt marshes are another, and the aerial habitat, which includes the vegetation of the marsh surface. This aerial habitat is where you find the grass and plant hoppers, gore wasps, beetles, spiders, snails, egrets, chats who are salt marsh specialists, magpie larks, stilts, kites and harriers. This is the top end of the town. It's where you'll find the hunters. The benthic habitat is the productivity engine of the salt marsh. Cyanobacteria produce an organic slime, which is colonised by periphytic algae like diatoms, and this is eaten by things that live in the aquatic habitat, in the creeks and channels that hold water most of the time. Things like protozoa, nematodes, copepods, annelid worms, rotifers and small crustaceans such as juvenile prawns who spend time in the creeks and channels before heading back out to sea once grown, and especially the little mud crab, who we'll talk about some more on the next slide. These creeks, channels and pools are much loved by wading birds such as the egrets, the herons, spoonbills, sandpipers and stints. While you saw on the previous slide how the food webs of the aerial, benthic and aquatic habitats of the salt marsh are all connected, it goes even further. The salt marsh habitat is connected to the mudflat, to the seagrass meadows and the deeper offshore habitats, and this is one of the ways that they're connected. The little mud crab, Heliograspis haswellianus, lives in burrows on the mud of the salt marsh. At the higher tides of the month, when the salt marsh surface is inundated, these crabs release their zoe synchronously from the second night of flooding, in countless numbers. Studies in New South Wales with fish that entered the flooded salt marsh found that the stomach contents of fish entering the salt marsh were 12% heavier than the same species that were caught in the creeks and channels before the flooding. Or at the same species, that were caught at the high spring tide in areas where there wasn't any salt marsh to flood. While I've picked on the little mud crab here, the other little crabs, sentinel crabs, etc., do the same. And this is only one of the pathways. Fisheries scientists have only become interested in looking at salt marsh and its impact on fisheries quite recently, since about 2006, so there is lots more to find out yet about the connectivity of our coastal habitats. But finally, here we are, a connection to the iconic Eyre Peninsula cuttlefish. While the cuttlefish are not eating during their mating aggregation, which is really the end of the road for them, this short-lived species gets as big as it does by eating fish and prawns and almost anything else it can catch in the 2 years leading up to mating. The salt marshes of Spencer Gulf have sheltered and fed the juvenile prawns and fattened the moonlight promenading fish, which the cuttles will gobble up over their lifetimes. So thank you all for listening today. And if you have any questions about the connections between our amazing salt marshes and the marine environment, please feel free to hop on the socials listed here, and I'll do my best to answer.